Well, for more analysis on this, joining us is Ulrich Brueckner. He's a professor of European Studies at Stanford University in Berlin. The EU says then it's preparing to retaliate against Trump's tariffs. First of all, do you think that's the right approach? And second of all, what measures would be most effective in Europe?
Well, we had different discussions about this because it's not a new approach. We have seen the same story in the first Trump administration, and it actually goes back to 1990 when he gave an interview to Playboy magazine in which he expressed that the European Union was built to exploit the United States and the whole world is exploiting the US. So he never quite understood the benefits of globalization and a global order that was ironically designed by the United States in the first place. So the consequences of such a system is that we are so mutually interdependent and that decades of globalization brought us so closely together that it is very difficult to de-risk and to decouple and to reorganize cross-border supply chains. And what matters the most, such initiatives hit both sides. It's like sanctions, and therefore it's a classical lose-lose situation.
So do you think then that, one response from the EU could just be to lie back and say, look, we're not going to do anything, we're just going to see what happens with the US. But that doesn't sound like what they're doing. It sounds like they certainly say they're preparing a raft of reciprocal measures. Do you think that's the correct thing for the EU and Ursula von der Leyen to be doing? And what measures do you think might be the most effective?
Well, there have been countries that were rather looking into what could we do to please him because he's so emotional in his reactions. Now a majority of EU member states believe that countermeasures would be better because he understands the language of power best. But as I said before, every measure works in both ways. It will affect sensitive industries, it will increase inflation. What we might see as a buffer is changes in the financial market, that a devaluation of the euro makes exports cheaper, so that might help in the short run. But in the long run, what would work best is to establish a new multilateral system that works better than in the past. Because on the one hand, the world became richer with globalization, but the benefits of globalization weren't distributed equally. And we should also consider the consequences for the global south and not only navel gaze and look at what are our consequences and what could we do to flex muscles, but to think about what would be a fairer global order.
Yeah, I want to pick up a bit on what you're saying there, Ulrich. Ursula von der Leyen said in her speech today that she agrees with President Trump that some countries are taking, in her words, unfair advantage of the current rules. What do you think she meant by that? What countries is she referring to, and what could be done to address that, if not tariffs?
Well, it is always difficult if you play with normative categories like fairness. When we look, for example, at China's overproduction as a consequence of their suffering housing market, in which the Communist Party created overcapacities and floods markets with products that couldn't be sold domestically, then the Chinese interpretation of this initiative is a very different one compared with the American and the European Union one. So conflicts of that kind were in the past discussed in a multilateral system with functioning international organizations like the World Trade Organization. But what we now see is a dysfunctional global order in which a lot of these institutions suffer from forms of manipulation, that countries don't pay their contribution to it or disrespect international rules or just leave, as we heard this morning that Hungary is leaving the International Criminal Court. So all of these steps undermine the functioning of a rule-based order. And no matter what tit-for-tat strategy would work in a particular case, it doesn't fix the overall problem that we are in a shrinking planet in which everything is interconnected. And it doesn't help if one flexes muscles and believes that this is the golden age of a single country. This simply fails.
Okay, Ulrich Brueckner from Stanford University in Berlin, thank you so much for joining us.